having him on the team now is he is also a high school teacher.
Yeah, and as a result of that, I've been thinking a whole lot about the pushback on Black studies. It's kind of painful to say, but students are being trained to be ignorant.
And just say more about that. What do you mean by that?
As a teacher and someone who spent a lot of time facilitating difficult dialogue and conversations around race and equity and justice, it makes me wonder what happens to our students when they are denied the truth. How can we expect them to become a contributing member of society?
Right. Well, coming up on Notes from America, that's what we're going to dig into with African American Studies professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. We'll talk about the real ideas in Black studies and why those ideas can be so threatening. Plus, we continue our Black History Is Now series by meeting the trailblazing ballet dancer, Misty Copeland. That's all coming up right after this.
We're here on the campus of Howard University, and we're asking people, when was the last time you learned a new idea that challenged the way you see yourself or the world around you?
In class last week, my professor was discussing the idea of radical self-care as introduced by Audre Lorde, that self-care doesn't mean that you're lazy, but it's rather productivity. If you're not pouring into yourself, you can't help your community or the people around you.
So I'm actually a transfer student. I wanted to go to Howard straight out of high school, but everybody was pushing me to go to PWI. It wasn't until my best friend kind of sat me down, I realized that that was such an invalidating opinion of HBCUs.
Yesterday during class, we were having a discussion about the systems right now that are a direct consequence of racist policies from 200, 300 years ago.
It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright, and welcome to the show. Here's the thing about new ideas. The best ones, the most consequential ones, they are often hard to take in. They challenge us, and not just intellectually. They call into question things we hold dear, or that make us feel comfortable, or they just seem obvious. The sky is blue and the earth is flat, until someone points out that it is in fact not. New ideas that are of consequence are often hard. And Black people in the United States have very often been the bearers of new, hard ideas for everybody. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has brought some of those ideas forward herself. Her 2019 book, Race for Profit, introduced many readers to the idea of predatory inclusion, or the ways in which the financial sector enriches itself by preying upon Black ambitions. That book was a finalist for both a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. And she's just founded a new magazine called Hammer and Hope, dedicated to ideas from and about Black politics and culture. But Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is also a professor of African American studies at Northwestern University, and as such, her entire field of study is currently under partisan attack, not only in Florida, but around the country. The field is articulating a set of ideas that some are finding very hard to take in. She joins me to talk about this moment, about the power of ideas, and about the new magazine. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, thanks so much for taking time.
Thanks for having me.
The term Black Studies has been bandied about broadly enough that I'm not sure that many people using it actually know what ideas it represents. And I'm not being shady there, honestly, like maybe me included.
Mm-hmm.
So let's level set. What is Black Studies?
Black studies, African American studies, Africana studies, all of these kind of different nomenclature are really efforts to capture the ways that the history, experiences, culture, lives of Black people, African Americans, Black people throughout the diaspora. So not just African Americans, what our lives are about, what constitutes them historically, culturally, politically over time. And so in some ways, the teaching of that happened in different iterations throughout the process of higher education in historically Black colleges and universities. But it really wasn't until the late 1960s that the study of Black life became part of the curriculum at predominantly white institutions. And that was a direct result of the kind of Black insurgency that exploded in the aftermath of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. And so part of that was a demand of Black students to understand the dimensions of their lives and history at school, to learn about themselves in school in ways similar to how other people would learn about their own cultures and history in school. And so Black Studies was really an effort to define what that would look like as part of as part of a curriculum, but that comes out of a much larger political movement.
And Black Studies is, as a course of study, as an inquiry, it is distinct from African American history as a course of
yes.
study. And can you just help people understand that distinction?
Sure. I mean, African American history is about the kind of people, places, and things that populate the existence of Black people in the United States from 1619 thereabouts. Usually, sometimes it's from to 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation is, and then from 1863 to the kind of contemporary period. That's usually how African American history courses break up that time period. But that's very different from African American studies, which also not only looks at history, so history is an important part of that, but also looks at politics. It also looks at economics. It looks at culture. It is not just concerned with the experiences of African Americans or Black people from the United States, but is really looking at the dimensions of Black life from what we refer to as the diaspora. So people who originate in Africa, but end up in places all over the Western Hemisphere as a result of slavery. So it is interested in the lives of Black people in Latin America, Black people in the Caribbean, Black people in Europe, Black people in Canada, in North America, Black Mexicans. And so it's much more expansive than just the kind of historical view of what happens to Black people in the United States from 1619 until the 21st century.
And embedded in that, if I can push it a little,
Sure.
The idea is that there is an analysis involved in Black studies, right? I mean,
Yeah.
which is not to say that there is an analysis involved in African American history, but there is an argument. Help me with the language, but there is a step beyond. This is the Black experience when you talk about studying Black lives globally.
Well, I think part of it, Black studies is very contested. So there are different ideas about what it should be doing. Should it be educating Black people and people sympathetic to the Black struggle for freedom, to be activists, to be involved in politics? Should it be mostly thinking about theory? Should it be mostly historical? And so Black studies is very contentious and contested among those of us who study it. But I think, part of what it is trying to do is understand the ways that Black people have suffered disproportionate effects of oppression and exploitation. Where does race come from? What is the relationship between race and the overrepresentation among African Americans, among Black people more generally, the overrepresentation of us among the impoverished, the underhoused, the under-resourced? How do we understand that? And so there is historically, within the field of Black studies, has been a kind of belief that this knowledge, analysis, understanding is not just for itself. It's not just for knowing information for the sake of knowing information, but how do we employ that in an ongoing political, social, economic struggle to get free? Because we see, from the police killings, the continuation of police killings, the way that Black women are overrepresented among those who suffer eviction, all of the social categories that we look at, the social barometers that we determine what is the quality of life in this country and beyond. Should we be involved in a political struggle to change those? And so there are certainly some people who are in the field of African American studies that believe that. Other people believe that, this is an academic field, but I think most people agree that it's not just about stating facts and figures. It is about trying to understand how Black people came to be overrepresented in these categories that represent oppression and exploitation.
And having said that, if we're in this political moment where this field of study is being defined by some as a threat,
Yes.
and I kind of wonder if, are they right? I mean, I put that to you, is it in fact a threat to the status quo?
I think any information that which makes us more intelligent, understanding, empathic, clear about the world that we live in is dangerous for those who are interested in defending the status quo and those who are interested in not rocking the boat. That means that history is dangerous. It's not just Black history or African American studies that these people don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about any of the histories of struggle and resistance against the kind of dominant forces of society. But I do think that there is something particular in this United States about the power of Black studies, because I do think that any engagement with the history of Black people and the kind of attendant ideas that come out of that history, if you want to talk about Black studies writ large, really begins to shatter the mythologies that the United States has constructed itself upon. If we are to believe that this country is the kind of paradigmatic example of what a democratic nation is, of what a just nation is, of what a free nation is, that all unravels. It all falls apart when you include the history of Black people who came here as slaves, who were enslaved for more than 300 years, and then after slavery faced another 100 years of legal subjugation. So almost 400 years of legal subjugation in one form or another, either as slaves or as second-class citizens. Then the whole notion of the U.S. as an exceptional place, as exceptionally democratic, just, and free, completely unravels. And if that unravels, then perhaps when Black people make claims for reparations, that maybe it has some truth to it.
We need to take a break, and we're going to
Sure.
come back to this. I'm talking with Northwestern University Professor of African American Studies, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. After a break, we'll talk about the new magazine and more about the power of these ideas in social movement. Stay with us. It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright, and I'm talking with Northwestern University Professor of African American Studies, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. We're talking about the power of ideas in social change and how threatening the ideas in the field of Black studies have been to some, because it does, in fact, challenge the status quo. Listeners, we can take calls from those of you who are, like Keeanga, educators. Curriculum that explores race, gender, inequality generally is now very much at the center of partisan politics, as Republican candidates have focused intensely on schools at all levels. And I'd love to hear how that reality is showing up or is not showing up in your classrooms, and how it's impacting your work. 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. If you are an educator and you want to chime in on this, or if you have a question for Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, you can give us a call. 844-745-TALK. And Keeanga, as a student of ideas, I want to ask you to think back, if you can, to how you discovered Black studies. Like, can you recall the sort of moment of discovery where you were just like, when a new idea grabs you and shakes you and excites you? Can you remember that moment for yourself in this field?
Well, I am Black. And I grew up with, both my parents were educators. My mom was not a teacher, but she was an educator of educators. And my father is a historian. So, I grew up in that sense, I grew up with Black studies. I grew up in a house with books that celebrated Black people, Black history. As a, small child, before I was reading, but books that were read to me were about African-American history. And so I think probably when I began to think about these things sort of on my own, there's like fourth grade, we were asked to write a little paragraph or something about Abraham Lincoln. And I asked my dad about it. And, my father was very colorful. It's kind of like, Abraham Lincoln was a racist dog, and so, but I brought this up in the small paragraph that I was supposed to be writing for school. There was a conference that involved my mother. My mother calls my dad because my folks were separated at that time. And all I remember from their conversation is she's 9 years old, so this kind of, history and ideas, in some ways has always been with me in one form or another. I've always been fascinated by Black history. And then, I began to understand Black studies is much more expansive. When I went to graduate school, I got a PhD in African-American studies. And that's, I think, when I began to understand it as a much more expansive field, just beyond the history of African-Americans.
I don't know what it is about fourth grade. That is for me also learning. I think it's the Civil War starts to come up in civics class, and you're like, wait a minute, I don't know. Something's not right about the way this is being talked about. I can't quite articulate it.
Yeah.
What about it challenged you? I mean, part of the premise I've laid out here is that like new ideas of consequence are challenging. And I think, there are a lot of ideas in Black studies that are challenging to Black people too. What about it challenged you?
I think really for me, and I would say probably this is common for a lot of Black Americans, is realizing that you're not the only Black people in the world. I mean, there's a way in which living at the center of the empire, you kind of take on the empire sensibility that you are the center of the world, and that your experience is the most important one. And so for me, it wasn't so much a challenge, it was a discovery that there is a much more expansive diaspora. I mean, I knew there were other Black people in the world, but that have distinct culture and politics that flow from their experiences, but that we all got on this side of the world through the institution of slavery. And so really understanding the diasporic nature of Black identity in the United States and beyond was revelatory for me.
And and I think continues to be revelatory for a lot of African Americans.
Yes.
Certainly for me, every time I travel the world.
Yeah.
You are one of the scholars in this field whose work has been specifically targeted as too political for the classroom. And when you hear that argument, just that basic point, that this is too political for the classroom, this is indoctrination, how do you respond to it? And I'm thinking now specifically about yourself. How do you respond to that?
Well, all education is political. And I think when Ron DeSantis and people in the Republican Party are talking about history, what they don't like are the politics of some of the people who are writing history, writing about politics, writing about culture. And they want to replace that history with history that they like. So, Donald Trump, in the twilight of his presidency, commissioned what he called the 1776 Commission, which was to basically come up with a version of American history that he and other evangelical Republicans liked. And so that portrayal of history is replete with politics and a particular vision of what American history is. And so they don't mind that. They just don't like this other version of history. So all education, what you decide to include, what you decide to leave out, is political, because we're all political people, whether we are actively engaged in politics or whether we are passive about it, meaning that we all have viewpoints, we all have ideas. So that is to me, goes without saying. Indoctrination is a different kind of accusation, because indoctrination is really about excluding versions of history, excluding ideas, and really trying to drill a certain set of politics, a certain way of thinking, to impose that on students, and to really discourage thinking, discourage any kind of engagement. And that is certainly not what I or any other educator that I know talk about. And, personally, I have a very clear kind of approach to teaching. And I tell my students that, I don't necessarily talk about my political commitments, but I do tell my students that my job is to help you learn how to think and to figure out things. And I don't need you to think like me. I don't want you to think like me. I want you to think for yourself. And to me, that's an important element of teaching. And that's why you'll hear many of us talk about the most important thing you want to leave a student with is the ability to think critically. And all of this kind of history that myself and people who have been excluded from this College Board list are engaged in are critical analyses of history, of culture, of politics, of social norms. It's not indoctrination. It's thinking critically and not just accepting at face value what we are told, but is really looking underneath. And that is what it means to be radical, right? The Latin definition, root of radical, is root. It means what is underneath. So yes, that is what we are trying to look at, is what is underneath, not just what you see in front of you. We're trying to teach people not to take at face value what you see, but be curious, interrogate, ask questions, think critically.
You mentioned the College Board, and just so that we loop everybody in, your work was amongst those that were removed from the final version of the AP Black Studies class that has been in the news. This is following Florida Republicans' challenge to its existence in the first place. Yes. The College Board has said revisions it made to that course were not a response to the challenge from Florida Republicans. It was just part of the normal evolution of a course from a pilot to an official curriculum. And you have expressed skepticism about that explanation. So do you want to speak to why why you were skeptical of that explanation?
Well, it's just simply unbelievable. I can believe that, perhaps they didn't change the entire curriculum and excise the particular authors and writers that they did because of Ron DeSantis. But this attack on Black history, Black studies, has been going on for a few years now. What began with the 1619 project that then turned into this kind of nonsensical attack on critical race theory, that then turned into attack on AP African American Studies. I think that clearly the College Board saw the writing on the wall and understood that there would be a right-wing backlash, because this has happened before. They revised the AP American History, U.S. History curriculum in 2014. And the Republicans also had a backlash against that. The Republican National Conference voted on a resolution denouncing the College Board and the revisions that they made to the AP U.S. History course. And what did the College Board do? They backtracked, and they, deferred to the hysteria created among Republican circles from the RNC on down. And they backtracked and they took out many of the changes that they made. So there was a history of this, that this is a political, it's a body that is sensitive to the politicization of AP, because they're trying to sell the course.
Let me with that in mind, let me ask you this, and I don't want to belabor this because there's a lot to get to. But as we talked about this on our editorial team, we got distracted over and over again by the presumption of any kind of advanced placement course being a good idea from a racial equity perspective. Why do you have to be in a certain lane in order to get this level of education? Can you just speak to that briefly before we move on to something else?
Yeah, I mean, there's a larger discussion to be had about advanced placement courses and who they're available to. I think that nationally, somewhere between 4 and 9% of Black college or high school age students actually take AP tests. And so the AP, or take AP courses. AP courses have been used to really create tiers of access to high quality education in public schools across the country. So there is a question to be raised about AP and why is this curriculum being developed for a very small stratum of students, and why are we not talking about how the study of African American history, Black life in general, is taught in public school. That is a larger discussion to have. I'm all for it.
Let's go to Fred in Minneapolis. Fred, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm just listening and really enjoying the conversation. And I just spoke with one of your teammates about, I'm working with my kids, which are middle school kids. And we are delving into the West and the notion that cowboys were typically white, which was not the case, and going with after enslavement, the development of cowboy culture, and the second syllable on that word cowboy, how derogatory a term that was, and then with that pushback that the original horse experts are really coming up from Mexico with the Spanish and indigenous people, and just the misrepresentation that's out there, the absent narratives that we don't hear.
Thank you very much, Fred. Absent narratives that we don't hear. I'm going to use that to segue into Hammer and Hope, because we're running out of time and I've not saved enough time to talk about the magazine. But speak briefly to Fred's point about the absent narratives that we don't hear in education, and why we don't hear them.
Well, I think that there's a history of student radicalism, student activism in the United States. That's how we got something like Black Studies, African American history in the first place. And it's empowering for students. They want to know about where they come from and who they are. And how they got here. And more importantly, they want to understand the circumstances in which they live and how those developed. And that is why these ideas are dangerous. That's why this history is dangerous. And that is why the most powerful people in the country are trying to stifle it and suppress it. It is a sort of, electoral trick. And, we don't want to talk about social programs or spending, so we will divert people's attention by talking about Black studies. But there's also something that they fear about teaching these sorts of ideas, this kind of history in class, because of the way that it empowers the students who are recipients of it. I think they know that.
And I will apologize that I've managed the clock poorly, so we don't have a ton of time now to talk about this awesome new magazine. But in the couple of minutes we've got left, what is the within this context, what is the mission of Hammer and Hope?
So Hammer and Hope is a new magazine that I have created with Jen Parker, who is a former staff editor at the New York Times. And what we wanted to do was create a space within the kind of wide ecosystem of publications to talk about Black politics, Black culture, Black activism, and really how we changed the conditions that helped to propel millions of people in the streets in 2020, a couple of years ago. And one of the magazine came out of discussions between Jen and I in the aftermath of that were frustrated about how did we go from 26 million people thereabouts in the streets to the Biden election and then the Georgia Senate races, and that was kind of it, right? And so what processes needed to take place to turn that anger and activism into organization and to prolonged political engagement to really change the reasons why people were pushed into the streets in the first place. So that's why we created this forum for people who are engaged in those struggles, for activists on the ground, for organizers on the ground, to be able to communicate with each other.
We are going to have you back to talk in more depth about everything that comes out of it. Hammerandhope.org is where you can find it. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is a professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University, a contributing writer to The New Yorker, and co-founder of the brand new Hammer and Hope magazine of Black politics and culture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, we continue our series we're calling Black History Is Now by sitting down with the history-making classical music dancer Misty Copeland.
Misty Copeland is a person that every Black ballerina wanted to be, still wants to be. At this point, she's sort of the gold standard for the Black ballerina.
Misty Copeland's story is one that I think all dancers, but more specifically dancers of color, can find inspiration from.
She is a legacy in the dance world.
She is a trailblazer to all of the little Black dancers who needed someone in their life to give them inspiration and dance. Whenever I dance, I feel like I can be myself. I can express myself. Whenever I'm dancing, I'm happy. I just love to dance.
Dance to me means growth. I've been dancing since the age of 3, and there's never too much you can learn. It's something that you can never really perfect, and it's something that you always work at, and there's continual development and inspiration.
Her legacy means to me, it's like looking in a mirror and seeing myself there, because when I talk to all of my friends and they have dancers that they look up to, it's mostly not people of color, but when I think of Misty Copeland, a dancer of color, I just think that's me.
I think seeing someone who, like me, had a single mom, was able to get what they wanted and what they needed out of life without having to compromise who they were, that means the world to me.
As it can be quoted in her book entitled Life in Motion, this is for the little brown girls.
Exactly.
It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright, and those young people are students at the Jones Haywood Dance School in Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1941 to educate Black youth in classical ballet. And as you heard, Misty Copeland is a hero to those young ladies and to many others. In 2015, Copeland became the first African-American woman ever to be a principal dancer at the American Ballet Theater. By that point, she was already a sensation well beyond the dance world. Her performances drew these huge crowds of new young audiences to this classical form. She'd even been in a Prince video. And this week, we continue a series we're calling Black History is Now by meeting Misty Copeland. She has thought a lot about the role she plays in the lives of young dancers like those students you heard, in part because she thinks so much about her own mentor. Last fall, she published a memoir called The Wind at My Back, Resilience, Grace, and Other Gifts from My Mentor, Raven Wilkinson. Now, Raven Wilkinson, who died in 2018, she was a Black soloist in one of the most important ballet companies of the 20th century. And Copeland writes about discovering Wilkinson as this other person who carried so many firsts and onlys, and about the friendship they developed.
The first time I came across Raven, I was in my 20s, still pretty new to being a soloist at American Ballet Theater, and really just searching for this sense of identity as a ballerina and belonging in this very white world. And I think I was injured at the time. I had sprained my ankle or something, and I was at home sulking on my couch and decided to turn PBS on and saw this documentary on the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, and everything changed. From there, it was seeing this Black woman come onto the screen for the first time, seeing this kind of recognition. And I'd seen other Black ballerinas. I knew, about Janet Collins and Virginia Johnson, of course, Dance Theater of Harlem, but for a ballerina to exist in the time that she did with one of the most recognizable ballet companies of the 20th century, to see the passion and love and hope that she had when speaking about her experiences, even the negative experiences of, her life being threatened by the KKK and the injustices that she had experienced in her life and within the ballet community. And yet she still had this undeniable love for the art form, and she was still such a champion for it. Yeah. It just made me look at my life and career so differently.
How did you meet?
Yeah. So I had actually just started working with my manager, Gilda Squire, and she's a great listener. And Raven would come up here and there whenever I would do interviews. And Gilda decided on her own to do some research and find out who this woman was and what her deal was she still alive, and found out she lived a block away from me on the Upper West Side.
Really?
Yes, it's really unbelievable. Like, I can't imagine how many times we probably passed each other on the street.
Oh, my goodness.
And Gilda suggested that we do a conversation at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And that was the very first time that I met her in person, was the night of the panel discussion.
Wow.
And we were inseparable ever since.
I want to make sure people don't lose track of the unique nature of that meeting. I mean, you were the only Black ballerina at the American Ballet Theater for the first many years of your career. Then in 2015, you made history as the first Black woman to be a principal dancer at ABT. That's the first time in 75 years at ABT at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I want to underline that connection and what it was like for you, given all of those superlatives and singularity in your life, to then come across this person from the 50s who was in a similarly singular moment.
Yeah, I don't know that I fully grasped that at the moment that I saw her and heard her speaking, but that was such a strong connection and understanding of what it is to be alone and the only. And yeah, it was the first over 10 years of my career that I was by myself in American Ballet Theater. And I needed to have a connection to someone who truly understood what that meant, the emotional and psychological weights that you carry with that experience. And Raven, I mean, she was a soloist with the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. To this day, it's rare to see a Black female soloist in a classical company. Yeah. And she was the first and only. It's not common that a dancer makes it out of the corps de ballet, which is the lowest rank. It's typically the structure of a company is the corps de ballet, the soloists, and then the principal dancers. And the corps de ballet are the large group of dancers that create the atmosphere, surround the soloists in the center. And Raven, went through the corps de ballet in a couple of years and became a soloist and was doing principal roles as a Black woman. And this story, I felt this sense of connection, of course, and that I belonged to a community I didn't know really, really existed, but at the same time, this frustration and anger. Why don't I know this story?
This story's erasure was so total that Misty says at the time she discovered Raven Wilkinson, there wasn't even a Wikipedia page about her.
I was working with dancers who worked with Raven in the company at American Ballet Theater. And it never came up. And there was conversation around me being the only Black woman or only the second ever female soloist of color in the company. And it's mind-blowing to me that those stories weren't even shared with me. She was an afterthought and something that people didn't even truly think about, what she did on the stage, but what she was experiencing off the stage that most people would break in 30 seconds.
Well, what did she experience?
Raven would be in Alabama, somewhere in the South, and she'd get on the tour bus, and the tour bus would be stopped by the KKK, and they'd run onto the bus and be searching for the Black person and threatening her life. They'd come onto the stage during a dress rehearsal. Like, these are the things that she was going through before having to step into this space and be mentally and physically and emotionally prepared to perform, and also perform for an audience of white people that didn't want her there. Like, it's unbelievable that she was able to perform the way she did. And I wish that I would have thought to ask her these things while she was still alive. I've asked her friends and roommates, how was she? Like, what type of space was she in when she'd get to the theater? And they were like, oh, it was like nothing happened. She would get prepared. They never talked about it. Just a pro, and go out there and do it. And it's just mind blowing to me. But it was unbelievable, the things that she witnessed and went through, which eventually led her to leaving America and going to Holland, where she performed the rest of her professional classical career away from America.
As with many Black people of that generation.
Exactly.
Got tired of it.
Yeah.
Misty Copeland's own story is also remarkable. But before telling it, she cautions people not to indulge their stereotypes about Black athletes and the cliche up from poverty narratives. That was not Raven Wilkinson's story, for instance.
Then that's not the experience of every Black person in America.
It's not
we
all
come
under
from
this and less that.
Exactly. With that said, I grew up in a single parent home. My mother raising 6 children, and extracurricular activities, the arts, sports, whatever it was, like that was the farthest thing from my mother's mind. It was keeping us off the street. It was keeping food on the table, roof over our heads, which wasn't always the case. We were constantly moving. I'd say from the time I was born until the age of 7, we had moved 10 or more times and changed schools and sleeping in other people's homes that I didn't know. We had lived in motels. So there was just never this sense of comfort that I could relax. And music and dance became this solace for me. When I heard music, I wanted to move. It was this beautiful escape. And I grew up watching BET and VH1 and MTV and seeing music videos. That was what I thought dance was. That was my idea of dance. So when ballet was introduced to me, I was like, what is this? I'd never heard classical music before. It was all very foreign and I wasn't interested. And it took a lot of pushing and the teacher trying her best to articulate to me that I was a prodigy, that she'd never come across anyone that was as physically capable, like my body was retaining the information. It could physically do these things. But also, mentally, I had an understanding and the way to connect the music to my body. And I ended up living with my ballet teacher.
Once that teacher did convince Misty she had something, a lot happened fast. Professional ballet dancers typically train from the time they are little kids. But for Misty, after just 4 years of training as a teenager, she moved to New York and joined American Ballet Theater. Honestly, prodigy doesn't even describe that. And I was floored that she couldn't hear it when her teacher told her she was special.
If anything, I wanted to not be noticed. I wanted to hide. I had so much shame around my life and the way that I grew up. I didn't have a lot of friends because I didn't want them to know that we were scrounging for money in the couch cushions in order to buy food, and that, we didn't have a home. And so just this thought of standing out or being special or unique in any way. I mean, I was used to being different, but not kind of with this positive take on things. I mean, I don't think that I understood that until I was an adult. I started to fall in love with ballet and I really enjoyed the work. I enjoyed being in the studio. I enjoyed the repetition. I enjoyed this structure that I'd never experienced in my life and I was craving. And I kind of held on to all of those things rather than you're naturally gifted. But it was really difficult for me to embrace that I was good at something.
Well, as you have now become a mentor yourself, what kinds of things are you hearing from young people who aspire to be classical dancers? What do you hear in terms of their challenges and their inspirations?
It's changed so much. I feel like before it was how do I even get my foot in the door and even have an opportunity to show what I can do? And now the conversation is what do I do once I'm in the room? It's a different time, even after the last 2-3 years, a lot has shifted in the ballet world. And then you add social media onto it. And so a lot of it, I'm I don't even know what you're talking about. I'm so far removed from but it's so empowering to see young people want to make an impact and have a voice. I think that's the difference, is that whereas before a lot of Black and brown dancers were terrified to even step into that position of saying something, of sharing their experiences out of the fear of not even being given an opportunity because they'd be reprimanded. And now it's what platform do I use? How do I get my voice? They want to be activists. They want to move the needle. So yeah, it's a very different time. And it's fascinating to be in this position and having seen so much growth and change within our community in the ballet world. And I'm just proud that I have, so many dancers that are doing the work that I've been fighting for and doing for my entire 25-year career.
In those 25 years, you performed some iconic parts, but in the book, you described this vivid moment with Raven Wilkinson that happened right after you danced Swan Lake at the Met, which you were the first Black woman to do that. Tell us about that moment and why it sticks with you.
This is probably one of the most memorable, not just in my mind, but in my body and in my emotions of my time with her. Raven talked about this want to perform at Lincoln Center as a classical ballerina, and she never got the opportunity to. She had auditioned for the Metropolitan Opera Ballet and was not accepted, which is unbelievable. And, in 2015, she was able to step onto the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House after my debut in Swan Lake as the lead, as Odette O'Deal, and present me flowers. And it was this kind of outer body experience. She was actually passing the torch to me. And she was standing on the stage of the Met where she should have been able to dance. And she undulated her arms like a swan, and the audience just erupted into screams and applause. And I just remember crying and falling to my knees and trying to pass the flowers back to her, and she's passing them back to me. It was one of the most special moments of just giving her flowers.
Quite literally.
Quite literally.
Notes from America is a production of WNYC Studios. You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And by the way, later this week, we'll put a longer version of the conversation with Misty Copeland in our feed. So check it out. You can also follow us on Instagram at Notes with Kai. Mixing and music by Jarrett Paul. Milton Ruiz is our live engineer. Our team also includes Karen Frillman, Vanessa Handy, Regina DeHeer, Rahima Nassa, Kusha Navadar, and Lindsay Foster Thomas. Andre Robert Lee is our executive producer, and I am Kai Wright. Thanks for spending this time with us.